Hello, and welcome to the Actual Tech Media Expert Series. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event on ransomware in 2023, what to expect, and how to prepare. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you. So we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that come in. That Q&A panel is also the place to just say hello, which a lot of you have been doing already. We love to hear where you're logging in from. And it's also the place to let us know if we can help in the unlikely event you have any technical issues. A browser refresh will fix most issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. At the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Now, these Expert Series events are special product neutral looks at pressing technology problems presented by an expert in the field, but the support of our sponsors makes it possible for us to bring you this content. So we want to give a special shout out to our sponsors today. Over the next few slides, I'm going to share some messages from our sponsors, and they'll refer to links that you can find in the handout section of your console at any time during the presentation. As always, the handout section also has a few valuable Actual Tech Media links as well. There's a link to the Gorilla Guide Book Club where you can get access to Actual Tech Media's great printed resources on technology topics. There's also a link to the ATM Event Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events, including other upcoming expert series. Like next Friday, we've got a great one coming up on remote work, so be sure to check that out. Now, before we get into the main presentation, a few words from our sponsors. We are supported by Rubrik. Companies around the world rely on Rubrik, the pioneer in zero-trust data security for business resilience against cyber attacks, malicious insiders, and operational disruptions. Rubrik Security Cloud, powered by machine intelligence, enables their customers to secure data access or data across the enterprise, cloud, and SaaS applications. We automatically protect data from cyber attacks, continuously monitor data risks, and quickly recover data and applications. You can learn more at rubrik.com/ransomware. Today's event is also sponsored by Cisco Umbrella. Cisco Umbrella is modern cybersecurity made easy. It offers flexible cloud-delivered security, combining multiple security functions into one solution so you can extend data protection to devices, remote users, and distributed locations anywhere. Umbrella is the easiest way to effectively protect your users everywhere in minutes, and there's a link there to start a free trial and see the Cisco difference. Again, links for Cisco and for Rubrik are in your handout section, and you can click on those at any time throughout the presentation. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. So to start us off here, I did want to ask a quick poll. And so this is before you hear from Alan about what to expect in 2023. We'd just like to get your perspective on what you're expecting from 2023. So do you think your company is more or less likely to be a target of ransomware attacks this year? So we've got the answers are rolling in. Appreciate everybody who's answered. And I'm gonna share those numbers, but I will tell you they're leaning very heavily in one direction, and I think you guys can all guess what direction that is. So I'll leave that poll open here while I discuss the results here, but the response of more likely is the clear winner, and then I think the threat will stay the same is a sort of a close second. Less likely has zero respondents for less likely. So everybody is expecting things to either stay as bad as they are or get worse in 2023. I think that's probably that's an assessment that I would agree with all of you on. So we had 57% more likely, 43, 44% thinking the threat will stay the same, 0% at less likely. So thanks to everybody who responded to that poll. We really appreciate your responses. So at this point, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter today, Alan Liska. Alan is a top ransomware expert on the good guy side. He's a first call for a lot of ransomware defense industry insiders and technology reporters who want to know up to the minute details about the latest attacks. He's also the author of several books on ransomware and security generally, but one of those ransomware books was actually published by Actual Tech Media. I can think of no one better than Alan to tell us about what to expect and how to prepare for ransomware in 2023. So Alan, welcome and take it away.
Thanks, Scott. And thank you to everybody who came in today. We appreciate you joining us. This is really exciting. It's also rather appropriate that we're talking about ransomware on Friday the 13th. But, I guess add that to the lexicon of other horror movies that are out there. So we're going to talk a little bit about ransomware in 2023, kind of what's ahead, and more importantly, how you can prepare for the what's happening. So let's start with some numbers. In 2022, we saw 2,566 victims posted to ransomware extortion sites versus 2,865 that were posted in 2021. So that's actually looks like a decline in terms of 300 fewer, almost 300 fewer ransomware victims posted to extortion sites versus 2021, which means that ransomware is over and we can all celebrate now, right? Things over. You don't need to attend the rest of the webinar. We're all good. Life is perfect, and there's no more ransomware. Obviously, the fact that we're having this means that's definitely not the case. So there are a couple of things that we need to discuss. The first is that there are conflicting reports as to whether or not ransomware is on the decline. There are some reports out there that say, there were fewer ransomware attacks in 2021 than there were in 2022. There are other reports that say there were significantly more than 2020 in 2022 than 2021. What I can tell you is that ransomware incident responders haven't seen a slowdown. They're still getting the same number of calls for people that need help that they were in 2021, if not more. Part of the problem is that the data leak sites or extortion sites have become an increasingly unreliable measure of ransomware activity. So the reason that we use leak site data, and leak site data are the number of victims that are posted to ransomware extortion sites. The reason that we use that data is it creates a baseline on which we can all agree, because overall ransomware data collection is so federated. So, Palo Alto has one view of ransomware attacks. Mandiant has another view of ransomware attacks. Checkpoint has another view. The FBI has a view. GCHQ in the United Kingdom has another view. Australian government has another view. Nobody has one ground truth of the total number of ransomware attacks. There is no reporting requirement when you've been hit with a ransomware attack. There are some exceptions for certain industries in certain countries, but overall, there is no reporting requirement for ransomware, so nobody really knows the number of ransomware attacks that have happened. So we start with data leak sites as kind of a baseline and assume the number is significantly higher from there. Whether or not ransomware activity is increased, decreased, or stayed about the same, and depending on who you talk to, you'll see all three of those views presented early this year. One thing that we know for sure, along with business email compromise, ransomware is still the most profitable cyber criminal activity. So the ransomware actors aren't moving away from ransomware. they're continuing to embrace it. They may just be doing other things as well, because that's still how they make the most money. And there's a whole ecosystem that's built up in support of these ransomware groups, and that's not going away either. Because it's not just the ransomware actor that makes money, it's the affiliates that sign on to their service. It's the initial access brokers that go around and gain that access and flip it over to the ransomware groups. They're the money launderers who spend their time helping the ransomware actors move their money out of Bitcoin or Monero into currency that they can actually spend. There's developers that help improve the ransomware. So there are all these different groups that are involved in building a ransomware product that is then used to attack victims around the world. Um, so, and those people aren't going to give up their income. And so there's going to be this continued trend of ransomware attacks going for as long as it continues to be profitable. It is a good sign to see the number of victims posted to data leak sites decrease. But again, we don't know that that necessarily means that the number of attacks have gone down. What we may be seeing is a change in a number of tactics, and those changes in tactics could be part of where we're having even more trouble collecting. So when we talk about what's coming in 2023, we'll start with there are more nation states getting involved in ransomware. So we've seen ransomware campaigns originating from nation state actors in Iran, China, Russia, and North Korea. Some of these, especially those coming from Russia and China, are meant to be either distraction attacks or disruption attacks. They're not necessarily meant to make money. They're meant to either be a distraction while the nation state actors go in and steal whatever data they're trying to steal, or they're meant to disrupt an organization or a company from operating temporarily while they're recovering from the ransomware attack. Others, especially the attacks originating from North Korea, are much more focused on are much more focused on making money. So anecdotally, North Korea has invested heavily in the last few years in cybercrime to fund their economy. So we've seen attacks on the SWIFT networks, which are the networks that allow banks to transfer money internationally between each other. We've seen a number of attacks that North Korea was behind on cryptocurrency exchanges, stealing Bitcoin from wallets on these cryptocurrency exchanges. We've seen a huge increase in ransomware attacks, and North Korea has been in ransomware for a long time. You go all the way back to WannaCry in 2017, where North Korea was behind that attack, and earlier attacks as well. But WannaCry was where most people really saw, oh hey, North Korea is doing ransomware. They've continued kind of quietly along, but in the last year they've really exploded with Maui and Holy Ghost, especially. Going after those targets. And in fact, the FBI managed to seize about $500,000 worth of ransom payments that were paid to North Korea. Now, that's a small fraction of the total amount that North Korea has made from ransomware in the last year, but it's still a start in trying to get some of that money back. So again, you are seeing these more nation state actors involved in ransomware. It's not just a cyber criminal activity, but a nation state activity. We're also seeing more of the extortion only ransomware attacks. So Karakurt and Lapsus are sort of the most well known of these, but there are more and more ransomware groups that are going extortion only. And what does that mean? No data is encrypted. So they get the initial access the same way they do, for a normal ransomware attack. They get into the network and they move around the network the same way they normally do. Instead of encrypting data, they just steal data and then publish it to their extortion site, and or threaten to publish it to their extortion site unless you pay. Um, right now, this is really popular and growing in popularity, and we think it will continue to grow in popularity in 2023. The big question that a lot of people, myself included, have around these extortion only attacks is whether or not they are profitable. So you have to remember, most ransomware groups are looking to make money. And so that's always what you have to ask yourself as to whether or not this is going to be a trend. A great example of this, we saw this a few years back, where some researchers figured out how to install ransomware on a digital camera. A lot of digital cameras now have Wi-Fi connections, and researchers, figured out that they could use that Wi-Fi connection, use a flaw in it to gain access to the camera, and then encrypt the SIM card, or encrypt the SD card on the camera. Cool lab project, but if I'm a ransomware actor, is it really worth the money, the time and effort to take to develop a ransomware like that? And is anybody going to pay me? I mean, most people are just going to say, "Oh, SIM card or SD card's done. Pop in a new SD card, and then that's it." The pictures that are on there, except in very rare circumstances, aren't going to be worth so much money that you'd be willing to pay a ransom. Well, that's kind of what we're looking at here with the stolen data. There is a strong argument to be made that getting your stolen data back, or getting you're making sure your stolen data is not published, because you have copies of the data, so it's not stolen, or the data itself isn't stolen, but it's copied and exfiltrated out of the network. So there's an argument to be made that not having your data published might encourage people to pay. But, and Scott, you and I have talked about this before, the whole world knows that ransomware actors are lying bastards. So nobody trusts that the data is actually going to be deleted. So literally what you are paying for when you pay a ransom in that case is you are paying to not have your data published on the extortion site. The bad guys are still going to have your data. They will probably go ahead and sell it a little bit later. They're going to send you an image that looks like them secure deleting your data, but nobody actually believes that. And in fact, with some of the ransomware groups where we've been able to uncover some of their, like one of the ransomware groups we saw, they had a GIF of that looked like secure data, and that's what they would send to people as proof of the data deleted. They sent them all just the exact same GIF. They weren't making new ones for each one, so your data was not secure deleted. So is it worth it to not have your data published on these extortion sites? For some victims, absolutely, even though they know that that data is eventually going to get sold in the underground market. I just don't know how big of a I don't know how big that is, and I don't know how much people are willing to pay to not have data published on these extortion only sites. So something to think about going forward. We are going to see more of this in 2023. If it turns out not to be profitable, then the bad guys won't keep doing it. We're also seeing some different targeted focuses. Ransomware attacks against schools worldwide are up significantly between 2021 and 22. They're down in the US slightly. Like there were 2 fewer in 2022 than there were in 2021. So, we'll say about even, but overall they were up. We've seen more attacks on national governments. You see a couple of examples here. The Iranian ransomware attackers went after the Albanian government, and then Conti against Costa Rica. But there were more than 50 attacks against national government or national government agencies this year. We've never seen ransomware actors go after national governments in the intentional way that they did this year. So that is a big problem going forward. We expect to see more of these kind of disruptions. The weird thing is, this is one of those cases where generally governments don't pay. We've never seen an example of a national government paying a ransomware actor. But it does bring a lot of notoriety to the ransomware group in what, if, at least for now, is a good way. And this is ongoing part of the problem that we're seeing, is because that not most of the ransomware actors, not the ones carrying out the attacks, but most of the core group of these ransomware groups are based in Russia. There are no consequences for these attacks. So they can carry out an attack against a nation state and not have to worry about repercussions, because our laws haven't quite caught up. So we have a civilian cyber criminal actor engaging in nation state activity, but we don't have a way to respond to that. And so far, no one's accepted my suggestion of just drone them. I mean, one drone strike against one ransomware actor, and I guarantee you a whole lot of other ransomware actors will retire really fast because they're a bunch of cowards. But so far, no government's wanted to pick up on that for probably understandably geopolitical reasons. We've also seen an increase in attack on construction companies. Construction companies tend to be fairly large. We're talking about the larger construction companies and the ones that supply products. So like Pemex in Mexico, which makes concrete for much of the world. As an example, we've seen a big increase in those because they tend to be large companies with low investment in cybersecurity. We're also seeing ransomware actors. So, on the one hand, we're seeing them go after national governments. On the other hand, we also see them go after what we traditionally consider smaller businesses. So things like realtors, auto dealerships, dental offices. We've seen more of those hit this year than in any other year. So these are often businesses that may be considered small by most standards, but maybe the largest employer in their town or in their region. So relatively large for the region. These ransom demands tend to be smaller, anywhere between $25,000 and $50,000. But even though that these may be the largest employers in the area, they still don't tend to have security people, not only not on staff, but they don't have security people in general. They may have a person who comes by once or twice a month and installs patches and does other things. And so they'll have that, but they won't have a routine in place security program that they that they're regularly updating and regularly managing with, which makes them very attractive for ransomware groups because they're much more likely to pay, unfortunately, because unlike a large company which might be able to survive months and months of recovery, if these small businesses even have the ability to recover, they can't necessarily be offline for months and months without going out of business. So they've become much more attractive, and it's one of those where small, compared to $100,000 plus ransom or $1 million plus ransom for larger companies, these tend to be quick and easy. You turn around and you get the payments. We're also seeing ransomware get bigger. We saw Lockbit for the first time be the first ransomware group that officially posted more than 1,000 victims, over 1,200 at this point, to their extortion site, making them by far the largest ransomware group ever out there in terms of number of victims, surpassing Conti, who disappeared in March of this year. Well, technically, they finally disappeared in like June or July, who had just over 850. But we have a number of ransomware groups that have surpassed 200 victims and are, at 200 and even 300 victims. So you see, like with Pisa, you see Hive, you see Alfie, and some of the others that are out there. And you see Karakurt that we talked about earlier, is already past 150 victims posted to their extortion site. So I think that is really interesting to see that grow. One of the things that's interesting, if you look at this chart in terms of most prolific ransomware groups, Conti, Revil, Maze, Gregor, Doppelpaymer, Abaddon, Netwalker, are all gone. So, 7 of the largest ever ransomware groups, in terms of total number of victims posted to extortion site, are no longer in business. Now, all those members, they haven't been arrested. They've gone on to other ransomware groups and so on. But it is interesting to see that really when you take out the ones that are no longer active anymore, you really have Lockbit, and then you have everybody else in terms of total number of victims, which is kind of a fascinating trend to watch because in addition to ransomware getting bigger, it's also getting smaller. Recorded Future noted that there were more than 500 new ransomware variants reported in 2022. 500 new ransomware variants. Most of them had maybe one victim or maybe even no victim. So we'd find a new ransomware sample in the wild and then would never see it actually infect anybody. Or if it did, it never got reported. Um, and so, but 500 new ransomware victims blows away any previous number, or not victims, I'm sorry, ransomware variants in 2022 blows away any previous number. That's a huge number of new ransomware variants, a lot of them code reuse. So there were 3 big code leaks this year from Revil, from Conti, and from Lockbit. And a lot of these new ransomware groups that we're seeing are really just repurposing that leaked code and using it themselves instead of signing up to be an affiliate to one of these groups. And we are seeing that trend where you have the really big ransomware groups, but then you have lots of smaller groups that are deciding, I really don't want to be part of the big group. Like I don't want to be part of a ransomware as a service because again, you go back and you see that 7 of the biggest ransomware variants are no more. Most of the time, that's because they either got arrested, some government took down their infrastructure, or there was so much infighting that it kind of blew up. Lockbit, knock on wood that they won't be there that much longer, but Lockbit's the only one that seemed to have survived that so far. Again, hopefully that's not the case for much longer, but right now it is. And so, with that, that makes, and that goes back to the point I made earlier about collecting from data leak sites and ransomware extortion sites. In 2021, even though we had more victims, we collected from 44 different data leak sites. In 2022, that number is over 150 data leak sites that we're collecting, that by the end of the year we've collected from. So it's a huge expansion in the number of data leak sites that goes along with the number of ransomware groups that are out there. So, just something to keep in mind going forward. It makes it a lot harder to track and figure out what ransomware is there when you have so many of these new little variants that are only going to hit 1 or 2 people, if that, 1 or 2 victims, if that, before disappearing. So how do you prepare for what's coming in 2023? It's a good question. We're at the beginning of the year. Now is the time to plan a ransomware tabletop exercise. You have some very actionable items that you need to think about in your ransomware preparedness. Things like, hey, what happens if we get hit by a nation state? Every one of those nation states except for China is a sanctioned state. So if I get a ransom demand from North Korea or Iran, what am I going to do? What am I going to do if I have to pay that ransom because they've so thoroughly destroyed my network that I need to pay the ransom in order to get the decryption key? Who do I call? What's my process for that? Because if I pay that ransom to a sanctioned entity, I'm going to get a huge fine. And how do I deal with that, and so on. You have other things like, hey, what happens if we get hit with an extortion only attack? What happens if we get hit with an extortion only attack? And this happens quite a lot. Some of these, so with a traditional ransomware attack, your data is encrypted and then they have a note pop up on the desktop, right? With these data leak sites, oftentimes, or with these data leak groups, a lot of times what they do is they steal the data and then they send an email to somebody in the organization. What if somebody in the organization looks at that and goes, well, that looks like a phishing email, and just sends it to their spam folder, or it goes right to the spam folder and they never see it. I've seen that happen literally over a dozen times. So what happens when you first find out that you were hit by one of these extortion only groups? When the data appears on their website, or even worse, when one of your partners calls you and says, hey, why is your company's data, and by extension some of our data, on this data extortion website? What's going on? And you don't have an answer. So you've got to plan for what happens for a ransomware attack. How well are you protected against all of these new scenarios, as well as the older scenarios, because the regular ransomware attacks are still out there and still common. Um, and that means bringing in all the different parts of your organization that may be involved in a ransomware response. Your IT team, your backup team, your desktop team, your networking team, obviously your security team, your leadership, your public relations team. You need to have all of these people in the same room so that we're all on the same page. You and I that are attending this webinar, we live and breathe this stuff. We don't necessarily want to, we don't like it, but we don't have any choice but to live and breathe this stuff. We know what's out there. They don't. We need to have this, we need to use these tabletop exercises as an education moment where you can have these conversations with people and say, this is what's happening with ransomware now. How are we prepared for this? Again, we're not trying to be accusatory. We're not trying to say, oh, the desktop team sucks, they're not prepared. What we're trying to do is find out realistically what your organization is capable of, what kind of defenses you have in place, and where your weaknesses are, so you have time to focus on that. So this is supposed to be collaborative, cooperative, and making sure everybody really understands the threat, and in particular understanding what the strengths and weaknesses are in your organization and how to plan to deal with those. On that, you want them to be led by leadership. You want, again, you want leadership to be involved, because leadership's going to have to set the priorities in response. And leadership is going to have to be at the top of any kind of response that happens. And um, you know, and keep in mind, as this tweet from Kevin Beaumont points out, while you're doing your response, please keep in mind that the ransomware actors may still be in your network. If you've, especially in a traditional encryption ransomware attack, the ransomware actors like to linger to see what you're saying, what you're talking. They are reading your email. Come out with an out of band communication response before the attack happens. Because if they see an email going from you to somebody else on the team saying, hey, let's switch over to Signal, they're going to know that they've been discovered. So you really want to have this conversation ahead of time with, hey, this is going to be our out of band communication. Let's go ahead and set this up. Let's make sure everybody's involved, needs to be involved, and let's run a test through there. You may even make some friends in some of the other departments, which is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. Along with that, and Scott, I know you and I have talked about this before over and over again. Between 30 and 40% of ransomware attacks start with a phishing attack. Phishing attacks can be used for initial access, but they're also used to steal credentials, which can then be used in a later phishing attack. So really emphasizing this year the importance of phishing training. I know there are some people that question the effectiveness of phishing training. Good phishing training programs are definitely worth their weight in making sure employees are aware and getting them to be part of the extended security team. Now, obviously, the best thing in the world is if that phishing email never gets to the employees, so you really want to beef up your email security as well. Sometimes that's not in the budget. And if that's not in the budget for you this year, making sure your employees are really well trained with some of the common phishing techniques. There was just a report last week from Checkpoint, I think, about threat actors using ChatGPT, which is sort of the new fancy AI search engine, to develop better, more effective phishing lures. I've seen some of the poetry that ChatGPT writes, and so I'm not impressed, and I probably don't think I'd be impressed with any phishing lures that it could write, because a good phishing lure plays on your fears and your insecurities, and I don't think ChatGPT has quite figured out how to do that yet. But think these are the kind of things that the threat actors are thinking of right now. They're thinking of how to write better phishing emails to make sure they get more people clicking on their campaigns. So you need to be thinking about how you're going to defend against that. And if you start with just those two things, tabletop exercise and better phishing training for 2023, that's going to go a long way to protecting you from ransomware attacks. I am sure we will have other Ask the Expert series throughout the year where we talk about other and better ways to protect your network from ransomware. Start with those two things. That make those your two goals for 2023. That'll go a long way to keeping your organization safe and keeping ransomware actors out of your network. And I think we probably have time for some questions. So, Scott, if you are around, I'd love to talk to you.
Yeah, I'm here, Alan. Great presentation. Appreciate the Friday the 13th reference there. And, as always, I have a bunch of questions of my own, so I'll just mix those in with the audience questions here. But the first one, any changes in the form of legislation or regulation around the world that's been in process in 2022 that could make a difference in 2023?
It's interesting. We're starting to see more governments take ransomware as a threat more seriously, the way they do nation state attacks. So we saw, for example, in Australia where they set up a task force specifically to tackle ransomware. Japan is talking about doing the same thing. South Korea, after the attack on the Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto, Canada is talking about doing the same thing. We have seen in the United States, the United States has been very active in going after ransomware groups for a while now. President Biden has made it a priority. We have seen some states enact laws that forbid ransom payments, but we haven't seen for public entities. So it doesn't apply to companies or individuals. It applies to schools, libraries, state and local governments, etc. We haven't seen that have any kind of deterrent effect on the ransomware actors because the ransomware actors are, again, evil. They're going to assume you're going to find a way to be evil and cheat and pay the ransom if they make your life painful enough, no matter what laws are in the books. Without going on too much of a diatribe, we saw the same thing happen in Italy. So in the 70s and 80s, there was a huge increase in kidnappings. The mob and some of the more out there political parties decided that kidnapping was a great way to make money. So they pull some, they grab some rich person's kid and they demand a ransom. Ransom would get paid. They return the kid. And it got so bad that Italy's like, all right, we're going to make it illegal to pay a ransom. And what happened the year after that law was put into place was ransom kidnappings went up. Because now the mafia and the other groups that were doing this knew that they could not only get you for extortion to get your loved one back, but then they could also extort you because you paid you paid a ransom. So essentially double extortion, the same thing we see with ransomware groups now, only with people's actual lives at stake. It's a really fascinating history. I wish somebody would write like a definitive book on it, but the parallels between that and ransomware activity are fascinating.
Jeez. And you mentioned the task force in Australia and Canada, and I think it was Japan, in how the U.S. has been proactive. Is there a similar task force in the U.S. and like what department is it in, or is it in various states? I mean, like what's the situation here?
Yeah, so the Department of Justice is leading the task force, but it involves Treasury. It involves Secret Service, which is part of Treasury. So it involves all of the different compartments or all the different government components, because there are multiple ways that they're trying to attack it. So CISA, for example, has all of these programs in place for state and local governments and schools and tribal nations to help them improve their security. So that's one aspect of it. But then you have cryptocurrency experts who are who are helping the government trace the money, find the money, and pull it back. And in fact, if anybody watching today is looking for a good book to read, Andy Greenberg's Tracers in the Dark is a fantastic recounting of how the government's kind of gotten heavily involved in sort of a leading edge of cryptocurrency tracing. And then there's straight up hackback attacks. There is, we saw this with Revil, and we saw this with Black Matter, where they would take out infrastructure. The government would seize infrastructure, pull it back, and pull all the data that they could off of that infrastructure. So really, and you need that kind of three-pronged attack. Organizations need to better protect themselves, but given the legal restraints and going after some of the cyber criminal actors, governments need to be more proactive in keeping them from getting the money and spending the money when they get it, taking their infrastructure offline, and then when they can, because a lot of the affiliates of these ransomware groups are located outside of Russia, arrest them. We saw in the last year something like 18 arrests around the world. And in the US alone, there are 4 trials against ransomware actors that have been extradited from other countries going on right now. So, having this multi-pronged approach is what's needed. The sort of the law enforcement, the financial, and the protection of networks is really what's needed to stop ransomware.
That's really interesting. So some of the data that you presented, it was really interesting that. So there was, the chart with the various ransomware groups, and Lockbit was first. I assume the 1,200, is that across the lifetime of Lockbit's existence?
Yeah, so that's not just in 2002, but Lockbit started in 2021. Not 2022. Thank you. I'm old and I flash back to other years. Lockbit started in 2021, so that is 2021 and 2022. I don't think I've thrown any 2023 numbers.
That's still a lot for 2 years.
Yeah.
Then the other thing I wanted to ask you about that was, when you talk about ransomware groups, I wonder if you can define what that means. Because I was just wondering, is that an organization of people who know each other and are working together, or are they just sort of tag teaming on the same technology, same attack vector? What is a group in that sense?
Sure. So there are 2 different definitions. When we talk about the big groups, we're generally talking about ransomware as a service. And ransomware as a service is you have a core group, most of the time located in Russia, although not always. Most of the time located in Russia, and that's anywhere from 5 to 15 people, like, the people that wrote the code, the people that manage the portal, and so on. And they rent their infrastructure out to other people. And that's what we call ransomware as a service. And the affiliates are the one that rent the service. So let's say you decide you want to get into ransomware. And I have ransomware. I've built my own ransomware. You give me money, so you'll give me, whatever, $1,000, and then you're part of my, you're one of my affiliates, which means that I give you an executable, that is your executable. And what happens is you get into a network however you would normally do it. So whether you like to use a phishing attack, whether you have an exploit that you've been waiting to use, you get in, you move around the network, you deploy the ransomware. Your ransomware calls into my portal. And on the back end, just like any other portal, I provide you with which ransomware from which victim called in, the size of the victim. So they look at the IP address and say, oh, this belongs to this company here. And then I have my team that handles negotiations with the victims, and then I process the payment. So, I take in the payment from the bad guy. I take 10 to 20% off the top, depending on what we agreed to up front. I launder the money for you, and then I drop it into I launder the money and I drop the rest of it into your Bitcoin wallet for you, or multiple Bitcoin wallets for you at the end. That's the affiliate structure.
Okay.
Now, some of the smaller groups, so this sort of that second slide we talked about, those are just 4 or 5 people that are using their own code. They don't want affiliates. They don't want to get bigger, and so on. So generally, those tend to be 4 or 5 people. Maybe one that handles initial access. One that works on development, one that handles negotiation, or they may change up depending on which victim, and so on. So that is so that can vary, but they tend to be much smaller groups. Again, 4 or 5 people that kind of do everything in house.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so that leads into my next question, which is sort of what's the breakdown, to the extent that you can tell. I mean, understand this would be a huge ballpark figure, but, is it 20% of these attacks are coming from the groups and 70% small time actors, 10% state sponsored, or like what's the mix?
Yeah. So we'd probably be looking at right now, most of the attacks are coming from the groups. So I'd say the big groups, the ransomware as a service offerings, probably 60% of attacks.
Okay.
Nation state, even though that's a growing trend, still accounts for 10% or less of attacks. We don't know for sure because we don't know how extensive the North Korean attacks were. We're still trying to get full scope on that, but we think about 10%. And then the rest, the last 30% are coming from these smaller groups. But that was really a category that didn't exist in 2020. Started in 2021, grew in 2022. So it's a category that's growing fast. And if we continue to see the big ransomware as a service groups get taken offline by the government, all that's going to be left are these smaller groups.
So one of the things that you also mentioned was that 30 to 40%, these attacks originating from phishing attacks. How important is social engineering for ransomware criminals these days? Is it still as prevalent as it used to be?
We see social engineering primarily used with the extortion-only groups. So Lapsus and Karakut have done really great, and by great I mean bad.
Great,
extortion.
like Voldemort is great, doing great things. Harry Potter.
Right.
yeah.
But we've really seen Lapsus and Karakut launch some interesting social engineering attacks. Social engineering has kind of fallen out of favor because password reuse is so much easier. So we think we don't have any concrete evidence of this because it's really hard to get that. We think that actually password reuse is the most popular method of initial access, even more so than phishing. And that's just because there's so many stolen credentials available on underground forums, and you can basically buy stolen credentials for almost any organization out there. And a lot of that is because of password reuse. So like you may never have had passwords leaked out of your company, but if you have an employee that used their employee email address and their work password somewhere else, and that organization gets hit, then that is what the bad guys will try and gain access. And unfortunately, that works most of the time. Right. So even if you're doing everything right, if somebody else hasn't, and you have an employee that's reused their work password, that can lead to problems, which is why multi-factor authentication is so important in protecting against that type of attack.
Gotcha. So password reuse. What about other sort of, are there any other novel attack vectors that you're seeing become or just sort of emerging?
So the big one that we saw emerge in 2022, and I think is going to keep growing in 2023. We actually saw this used more often in 2021, but then really take off in 2022. Third party. So we're all interconnected now, right? We all have partners that connect into our network, and we connect into their network, and so on. So more organizations are realizing they don't have to specialize in everything, so they'd rather have somebody outsource and run it, which means that two things. One, if you have a managed service provider that's connected into your network because they manage some of your machines, then that becomes a potential entry point for ransomware groups. So you hit the ransomware actor will gain access to the managed service provider, realize, oh, this is a managed service provider. Look at all these different networks they have access to. So rather than deploy the ransomware there, they'll use that access to jump into the other networks and deploy the ransomware. So instead of one victim, they get 20 or 100 victims out of it. So that's one problem. The other problem is where your data is stored. This is another great example that we see with doctors, dentist office, and other places where doctors and dentists don't want to store large x-ray files locally when they can have somebody who specializes in that store that data for them. And if a ransomware actor gets into that managed service provider, then they can encrypt all of the dental records or x-rays or whatever else that sensitive data is there. They can seal it first and then encrypt it. Well, that takes, again, instead of taking one managed service provider offline, that takes potentially hundreds of dental offices or doctors' offices offline, and causes problems. I mean, just in the last few weeks, think about the Slack intrusion, the LastPass intrusion. That all of these, and those weren't ransomware attacks, but that's a great example of how an attack on a third party can impact hundreds or thousands of victims. And ransomware actors are really, really leaning into that now, knowing that it can raise the impact significantly of an attack.
Yeah, and somebody going after a password protection thing. I mean, it's even more horrifying because it's people trying to do the right thing, and
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're doing exactly what we tell you to do, and unfortunately, they get compromised.
When it comes to you talked a bit about extortion, and how it's maybe proving more difficult for the ransomware actors to prove that they're worth paying money to in those attacks. But so is it still primarily encryption where the main focus is? They want to encrypt your data so you can't use it and you have to pay them to get it back.
Yeah, I mean, I think about 90% of attacks right now are encryption plus data theft, with only 10% being data theft only. Again, it's a growing segment. I'm not convinced it's going to be profitable for the bad guys. And so I don't know if it'll continue, but for right now, it's because it's so much easier to do. A lot of the bad guys are interested in it.
Interesting. I guess two quick final questions for you. First, what are you most concerned about in 2023 as you look across everything here?
I think the biggest thing that we have to worry about is ransomware just becoming another tool in the tool belt of the bad guys. So we have a whole lot of different kinds of cybercrime activity that's happening. And right now we have specialties, right? We have people that primarily are fishers, carry out phishing campaigns. We have people that are primarily crypto miners. So we have these sort of specialties in ransomware. We have business email compromise specialists. What happens when ransomware, especially because of stolen code, that ransomware is so easy to get your hands on and deploy, that you just add that to your toolkit? So, I'm carrying out a business email compromise, but to do that, I had to get a hold of the mail server. Well, I've gotten them to transfer me $100,000 out of the network. Now let's go ahead and deploy the ransomware so I can do both, right? Or I'm a crypto miner. I've landed on 300 Linux servers, and Bitcoin is now below $10,000. I don't know that that's going to happen. So it's really, really hard for me to mine. But I have all these Linux servers that I can deploy ransomware on. So let's just go ahead and do that, because I'm not making any money from crypto mining. So my concern is that if it becomes that sort of toolkit, the sort of the typical image of the Batman utility belt. You have your Bat ransomware along with your Bat crypto miner and your Bat business email compromise and so on. I'm afraid that we'll see even more ransomware happen, and it'll be even more difficult for people to recover because these aren't people that specialize in ransomware. So if something goes wrong, they can't help you recover from it. Like, if the decryptor they give you doesn't work after you pay, oh, too bad. That's a shame. And move on. So I feel like it will create more and bigger problems for victims.
Interesting. And then I'd like to leave this on a somewhat positive note. So what are you most encouraged by looking forward to 2023 when it comes to ransomware?
So I'm really encouraged by the fact that governments are taking this seriously. And I mentioned this before. Governments are always so far behind when it comes to technology and figuring out how to put laws around the technology that everybody's adopted 5 years ago. We're seeing that we saw that for years. I know it's a completely different topic, but we saw that for years with like revenge porn, right? Where it was happening, it was destroying lives. Governments didn't have any tools for protecting victims of that, and so they had to figure out how to do that. Governments are now figuring out that they have to treat ransomware groups as something different than just a normal cyber criminal. If they can't treat them like a nation state group, what other methods do they have to effectively take out those people? And I think governments taking this seriously, it won't stop ransomware. What it will do is it'll make it more expensive to carry out ransomware attacks outside of Russia. And once you kill that affiliate structure for a lot of the bigger ransomware groups, there isn't nearly as much money in there. I think we're a long way from that, but we're moving in the right direction, and I think that's good.
Okay, well, I'll take that. Alan, thanks so much. You've been really generous with your time. I'm gonna let you go, but really appreciate all your insights on this. We always love to have you on these.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I enjoyed the conversation as always, and I want to thank you and thank everybody who came by today. I love doing these, and I love talking to you about this. So hopefully, we can do a few more this year.
All right, thanks.
All right. Thanks, Scott. And thank you so much to Mr. Alan Liska for joining us on the event today. I always learn so much, and I know the audience does as well. Thank you for all the excellent questions. We didn't have time to get to all of those, but we did our best. So this has been a great event. Before we go, I do want to, of course, announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card prize. This is going out to Mr. Michael Contreras from California. Congratulations, Michael Contreras from California. We'll be in touch to get you your gift card. All right. And with that, thank you so much on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team. And I want to make sure I also thank our sponsors, Rubrik and Cisco Umbrella, for joining us on the event. I hope that you learned a lot. Have a great day and stay safe. Protect yourself from ransomware. That concludes today's event. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.